Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and I'd like to welcome you to our 10th episode of our Performance Concepts Chat series. This episode, as you can see, I'm on the road here, and I wanted to get it out, so I'm doing the intro from the hotel room. And I feel that this is one of the more important ones we've done as of late. It's with Pat Davidson, who has his PhD in exercise physiology, has worked as an educator, worked as a coach for high-performance strongman athletes, knows a lot about the body, nutrition, and specifically what we're talking about today is the central nervous system, and using Pat's knowledge of neurotransmitters and training and trying to pull all the evidence together. We've exchanged research papers on the topic. He looks at things like chronic fatigue and what are the commonalities that impact athlete training, athlete development, athlete recovery. And so this is where it gets really interesting. And I think, like any of the talks we've had with really smart people, it raises more questions that we can all push towards to find out better ways to train our athletes and allow them to recover, and what the implications of true central nervous system stress and recovery are. So you're really going to enjoy this one. And if you have any questions, please contact us. Contact Pat. I'll give you some information on how to contact him. And just, please enjoy and hang on to your seatbelts.
Pat, thanks for joining me this morning. I've been looking forward to talk to you about a whole bunch of subjects. I know when I first saw you spoke, it was on energy systems, and I remember looking at the agenda and going, oh, God, somebody's speaking on energy systems. But, I mean, you turned it into this great discussion of how we could look at it differently, how we could approach it as coaches, sports scientists, and it just made it a lot easier for me to grasp. Not that I didn't have a grasp of energy systems, but when you really, pull away all the layers, it was definitely a lot easier for me to understand. So that's why I want to talk to you about this next topic, which is central nervous system fatigue. We hear about it all the time. I know when it was introduced to me, I was a youngster, and, Charlie Francis was talking about it in terms of how much recovery we have between sprints to optimize, the performance, the adaptation. And we just, back then I just thought, oh, okay, I have to take more time. We can't just rush these things if we want to get quality. But we never thought about the implications behind what is central nervous system fatigue. What's causing it? Is it the same type of energy that's required for other processes? So I wanted to ask you, and you wrote a very fascinating article, and I've reviewed it. It hasn't been published yet, but I think this is something that you have to get out there very soon, and get some credit for this. But I wanted to talk to you at least on the surface right now of what you think central nervous system fatigue is. What is your working definition right now?
Well, it's it's funny because I really I enjoyed seeing you speak at Northeastern as well, the first time we got a chance to meet. And I had a similar thing where it was kind of like, oh, speed development. Here we go again, like another track guy that's going to tell me about A skips and B skips and this stuff. And then I hadn't really been aware of your background. And then I heard your lovely Canadian accent, and I started thinking to myself, oh, this guy might be from the Charlie Francis school of thought. And because I think that reading Charlie's stuff was the most influential coaching applied work that has influenced me as a thinker on developing people. I found him to just look at things very differently than anyone else that I had read, coming from the performance world. So I was really, really blown away by what you had to say. And in particular, the way that you were looking at the brain and looking at other things than what most people are looking at. I've always just been a strong believer that I'm going to listen to what everybody's looking at and talking about and thinking about, and then I'm going to look at everything else that they're not looking at, and I'm going to try to figure out how to do exactly the opposite of what everybody's doing. Because if I do what you're doing, I'm going to develop people the same way you are, and it'll be even playing ground. If I develop people in a completely different way, I have the opportunity to develop people so that they can just blow everybody else out of the water. And that's all I've ever wanted to do. I've never wanted things to be even. I've wanted things to be divergent and different and find some other approach that works much better. So, it's kind of a mutual admiration society here. I can remember as a young up and coming strength coach in the late 90s, early 2000s, hearing people talking about like CNS fatigue and you're going to burn out your CNS. Like that was the go-to phrase. You're going to burn that thing out. And I accepted it as a young guy who respected his elders and the wisdom of kind of the greats. And you don't even think about it. You're just like, okay, I'm going to burn out my CNS, so I won't do that. So I'll be very careful with this. And then over the years, you're like, what does this actually mean? Like, what are we talking about here? And then usually you kind of hear the same sorts of things. Like people then start talking about the adrenal system, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not in your brain. Like that's a different place. Like, are we aware of this as a community? It's not the same thing. And then it's sort of like ultimately you have to become a person that follows reductionist thinking if you're going to be scientific about the way you analyze things. And reductionism has its problems, but it's also the most, I don't know, it's the best way to go about thinking, really, that we have so far, that we've developed as a species. So if you're going to tell me about the CNS and you're going to tell me about fatigue, well, then I have to study the structures that exist within the central nervous system. I have to study the brain and the spinal cord, and then I have to study the physiology of what actually causes the functioning of this equipment. And you get to this point where you're like, oh, it's neurotransmitters. Okay, they're the unit of communication that the cells within the CNS use to make them function, to do what they actually do. And then it's kind of, well, what do these cells do, like from a functional perspective? And it's super confusing because it's like we kind of know about the same amount about neurotransmitters or neurons as we do about like the surface of the ocean floor. Like very, very little. Like it's the far reaches, these unexplored frontiers of anatomy and physiology. We can't just look at this stuff during performance and measure it as it's working in live time. We have these sort of indirect measures and like post measures of like taking blood and inferring what that might mean. We have some animal studies of like injecting things into animals' brains while they're exercising. We have these, you know, human examples of when people have damaged brains from like warfare or like Phineas Gage with a railroad spike going through his head, and we say, okay, this part broke, and these are the results we see in this person. But to me, like the central question here is what is central fatigue? Is it a real thing? And like what can we wrap our hands around and say, this is what this topic is. I would say that it's ultimately a topic of neurotransmitter concentrations, binding activities, and what different levels of concentration and binding activity result in from a performance perspective.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into the specifics of those neurotransmitters, but I found it very interesting in your article. You talked about central fatigue, and I think we look at it always from the athlete perspective. But there's a lot going out there in the world with people suffering from things like chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, all these things, and there are, it sounds like there are some pretty significant connections between all of this. Why is it important that we understand what's going on elsewhere to turn around and apply it to our athletes?
Um, these are the questions that make me go into answers that might make me unpopular within the industry. But I would say that like overall within the whole population of humans on this planet, generally speaking, the best and brightest amongst us do not tend to go into working with athletes. Like they go into like medicine or law or physics or things like that. And then like the smart people that end up studying athletes are kind of like this like we're another cut that doesn't, like we're not the super geniuses that figure out like the most complicated questions on earth. We don't we're not at the level of like the rocket scientists. We're just kind of smart guys that get obsessed with this stuff, and we do our best with it, but we're not the modern day Da Vinci's and Einsteins out there. So it's kind of like we have to actually examine the science from the truly genius scientists who are tackling these hard problems of like real deal medicine and genetics and neuroscience and all that kind of stuff. Try to read what they're doing and potentially infer to our populations what that stuff might mean. So I think that like you're never going to like within the coaches, the bright coaches that write about pure sports stuff, they'll probably never give you the information that will truly be the groundbreaking stuff. You need to look outside of that to be able to find the real deal hard sciences that maybe possess, like I always think of the Fosbury flop, like this completely divergent move that people made fun of initially, but then turned out to like be the most groundbreaking thing within the high jump. Like it completely, like I don't think Dick Fosbury was even a particularly good jumper compared to other people with the traditional form, but then he used this new technique and separated himself from everybody else. Then you get the really good people doing it the same way, and all of a sudden, like the records just go into the stratospheres. But um, it's, I think that what we're seeing here in regards to chronic fatigue syndrome is that like real deal scientific researchers within neuroscience are tackling this problem. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like, well, this sounds an awful lot like what the overtraining model is in athletes. Where if you're going to look at these definitions of chronic fatigue, you see that it's kind of like a largely a subjective definition of people that are experiencing lethargy, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure at any point in time, seems to always follow suit. And I think that really one of the measures that I've heard you talk about that you personally use, which would be using electrical stimulation for athletes and seeing what level of electrical stimulation would cause the muscle to respond. And if it takes more electrical stimulation to make the muscle respond, they're probably fatigued. I think that is a really good indicator, actually, because it seems as though, from an objective perspective, the only way that these researchers are saying that you're centrally fatigued is when it takes more EMG activity to witness the same level of contractile behavior of a muscle. So if it takes more electrical activity, that means that the brain is resorting to compensatory strategies of trying to use more regions or more neurons to actually create the same uh, observable work output.
That's interesting because I know I had fooled around. I had a portable EMG unit, and we were doing maximal lifts, but the readings were always higher when we do it like max endurance. Like we got to the final reps, and then the levels would be higher. And I'm like, well, shouldn't we be fatigued? So we shouldn't be getting as high a reading. But what you're saying makes perfect sense now.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It makes you look at all those EMG studies in a different way too. Like, is more EMG really a good thing? Because it's actually telling me that it's compensatory. That's the word that you see over and over again in these neuroscience articles on fatigue. Like, you're probably training people to be fatigued. Like,
That's awesome. This is I'm happy we talked about that. Um, if we go deeper into some of the illnesses and problems that people are having, like PTSD, depression, anxiety, insomnia, fibromyalgia, you talk about corresponding low cortisol concentrations. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So it's really funny. You always hear about high cortisol being a problem. High cortisol, bad, bad, bad. But the reality is that it's demonstrating, like if I give you a stressor and you respond with a low cortisol response, that is bad. Like it tells me that you don't have the soldiers to be able to actually fight the war. Like it's an indicator that things are going bad for you if you have low cortisol responses to stress. Now, it's an acute versus chronic discussion that we're getting into. But overall, if you want to see a non-resilient human being, test them by their cortisol responses to stress. Like, and ultimately, I would assume that this would lead to like a more resilient athlete, a more resilient organism would be someone who has made adaptations to create larger adrenal glands that hold larger amounts of cortisol so that you can secrete larger like boluses of cortisol into the system in response to a stressor. Like it's it's almost a situation of just looking at it from a timeline perspective intelligently. If I'm looking at you in a chronic state and you have moderate levels of cortisol all the time, that's probably a terrible indication. If I'm looking at you in an acute stressor state and you produce more cortisol than other people, you're probably doing really, really well. Um,
Yeah, and I always wondered, like, you'll read about, and I don't know if it was just cyclists, but there's athletes who were illegally using cortisol
mm.
for performance enhancing reasons, and I always thought, well, that doesn't necessarily make sense, but what you're saying here makes sense in terms of its value.
Yeah, they'll what use like asthma inhalers, taking that beforehand, and I mean it makes sense. Cortisol is going to mobilize stored substrate, so you can have a more robust glycogen. It'll decouple glycogen from its stored state and make it readily available to use as an energy source within cells. So it's a catabolic thing. Like the more catabolic I can be during the time that I'm exercising, the better. And then shut that off during rest time.
Wow. Wow, that's very interesting. The other thing you touch on are genetic predispositions to chronic fatigue. And, I remember talking to Charlie, and he would say, well, we did this approach, more of a short to long speed approach with Ben because he had a very strong central nervous system and he could resist fatigue in that regard. So that worked for him. Whereas we had other athletes where we do a long to short because they didn't have as robust a central nervous system. Is this is a genetic predisposition in your mind?
Well, the literature on the topic says that there seems to be about a 50% concordance rate amongst monozygotic twins, which is always what you have to look at to be able to make the first steps in saying whether stress resistance or resiliency is a genetic based thing. So if you're at 50%, that's telling you, yes, there is a genetic component with this. So it's not fair, like some people you can throw them in the fire and they're able to keep coming back and dealing with it over and over again. Other people are just more fragile, and they will never possess the equal ability of someone that just has a genetic advantage over them. But at 50%, it's also saying that environment and upbringing plays an equal role here. So it's a very interesting area to get into on that front. Now, I don't think that whenever you hear something in the literature saying that we've got this monozygotic twin concordance rate, it means that they haven't really picked out the mechanisms by which that's happening. So we don't know what exactly is driving that, but it does seem as though there are some specific neurotransmitter differences, but it's more the receptors, from what I understand, that can be the difference maker. Um, and you're going to get into the receptors, generally speaking, for dopamine and serotonin within that discussion. Like uh, there's the with dopamine, you have people that have the DRD7 repeat receptor. And that receptor is kind of considered to be the mutant receptor or almost the broken receptor for dopamine. And what that means is that dopamine doesn't bind as well to the DRD47 repeat one. So those people constantly need more dopamine to get the dopamine response. Like it's never enough. Um, and what that really tells me is that, and we know that these are the kinds of people that tend to be adrenaline junkies or like thrill seekers, adventurers. They're never satisfied with anything. So those are probably the people that you would see as being, they just keep coming back for more and more and more. Whereas some people are just satisfied and seem to be okay with things. See, I think it's tough because there's a behavioral element, a psychological element with all of this. It's not just a pure physiology thing. There's a motivation and reward system that's tied into these motor resiliency, immuno phenomena. So it's very intricate, but I would think that you probably have these people that are the aberrant dopamine receptor people that are probably going to psychologically just want to keep coming back no matter what sort of state they're in. And on the other side, I know that with serotonin, they're like, in particular with track and field, with serotonin, you really want to look at a couple of areas but I would think that the motoneuron area for serotonin receptors is particularly interesting. There's two different kinds of serotonin receptors. You have the 5-HT2 receptor and the 5-HT1A receptor. The 5-HT2 receptor is an excitatory receptor for locomotive uh, strategies. It's just the motor neurons for serotonin are locomotion in nature. And if I have serotonin binding to 5-HT2, I will excite locomotion. If I have serotonin binding to 5-HT1A, I will inhibit locomotion. So it's a case of, if I'm seeing decreases in serotonin, I will potentially see locomotion performance drop off because I don't have as much binding to 5-HT2. I could conversely see decreases in locomotion performance as a result of increased serotonin because it could be starting to bind to 5-HT1A. So it's not so straightforward. You know what I mean? It's kind of like with some of these neurotransmitters, I want to see a U curve, an upside down U curve, like with serotonin. If serotonin is in the middle, I should have it binding sufficiently to 5-HT2. If it's excessive, I could see it beginning to bind to 5-HT1A, causing decreases in performance. And if it's depleted, I could see decreases in performance because it's not binding enough to 5-HT2. With dopamine, it seems as though I just want more and more and more. The more of that I can have, the more excitatory it's going to be for both motor responses and also for motivation and reward mechanisms. So it's kind of the CNS stuff is really tricky because I've got certain neurotransmitters that I just want to see go up, and other neurotransmitters that I want to see be in a sweet spot right in the middle. And I also have them working antagonistically against each other. So it's sort of like it's kind of like the three bears analogy, where I sort of want like mama bear neurotransmitter status as opposed to like papa bear or baby bear. Um, I think that from all the work that I've done in looking at this, like that's the closest I can say is probably good, uh, because man, it's like really hard reading and a lot to try to figure out with this stuff. But I think Mama Bear neurotransmitter is about the best case scenario that you can put people in.
Now it's really interesting. I'm going to kind of pick on this idea of receptors, and because I know Charlie had always talked about when in reference to performance enhancing drugs that the better athletes had more receptor sites for these substances, and that's why it made them better too. It wasn't just that they were taking the drugs and they got better; they were almost predisposed to being better and made
Mm-hmm.
better use of the drugs. And then he also talked about um, replacing receptors for tryptophan with tyrosine so that he could delay fatigue and these types of things. So I think this is a whole area that needs even further exploration, particularly in regards to athletes. What are your thoughts on that?
I got to tell you, I think he's right on the money. Like what we see here is like to it's really hard to make declarative statements on this, but I would say overall, serotonin will be associated with much more fatigue related stuff. Now, again, it depends on what part of the system we're talking about, but generally speaking, as serotonin increases, we're going to see people start to fatigue and crap out. And tryptophan is the precursor for serotonin. So it's kind of like the studies that are really helpful in looking at for showing this are generally the rat studies. And there's some where they'll inject tryptophan into the preoptic part of the brain. Like the preoptic and the anterior hypothalamus are the two most important areas of the brain for temperature regulation. And if I inject serotonin into the preoptic area, I see metabolic rate rise, I see heat production rise, and the animal tends to shut down motor performance because of heat-based factors. If I inject tryptophan into that same area, the exact same thing happens. And it's believed to be tryptophan as a precursor for serotonin and a heat-based response in the preoptic area shutting down whatever kind of motor performance. And generally it's running in rats. So, running is always kind of the ticket because most sports that we care about are running based. And, even in the 100 meters, fatigue resistance is a major factor. And it's probably heat based. It probably really is a heat driven thing. If I heat you up too much, heat scares organisms, particularly predatory organisms. They're going to conserve and shut down. So, and on the flip side, tyrosine is the direct precursor for dopamine. And as dopamine levels rise, it seems as though you increase motor output, like exploratory behavior increases, velocity of limb movement increases, the willingness to experience very high levels of central heat increases. You're okay with being really hot when dopamine levels rise. The other pieces with that are that, and this is stuff I was just reading yesterday, dopamine seems to increase vasodilation in the periphery, which would result in the ability to dissipate heat at a greater extent. It also seems to increase the sweating response. So, and I always think like if I have greater vasodilation in the periphery, it means I can get more heat to the periphery, which means I can increase electrical conductance rate in the periphery. So I'll be able to potentially get those action potentials to the muscles, and superficial muscle tissue tends to be more type 2 as opposed to that deeper muscle tissue being more type 1 and postural related. So that propulsive drive is potentially increased with all this stuff. And then you take that other step and you take a look at the relationship between testosterone and dopamine, and it seems as though it's a bidirectional agonistic effect between the two. So, I've always looked at like what makes people run faster, and I've always thought to myself, the only thing I've ever seen that really works is performance enhancing drugs. Like strength training seems to be kind of all over the place. Like training methodology seem to be all over the place. But if you give people like Winstrol or horses Winstrol, they run faster. And it's probably due to this bidirectional influence on dopamine. And dopamine is straight motor. It's the most powerful motor neurotransmitter, primarily in the basal ganglia. But it's going to increase drive and motivation, which will cause people to want to train more too. And they'll feel better, they'll be more confident, they're more likely to want to compete, which I think is just a major factor. But it does still come down to receptor binding levels. And I can remember years ago looking at some stuff from the East German literature on their steroid state-sponsored stuff, and oddly enough, like typically with normal circumstances, as testosterone levels increase, you'll see a decrease in binding sensitivity with the androgen receptor. But there seems to be this odd relationship of when you artificially create super physiological levels of testosterone or testosterone-like molecules, where binding sensitivity of the androgen receptor actually increases in sensitivity. So it's very strange in that regard, and I haven't seen any mechanistic responses for that. But we're also in this new age of like the post-human genome project, and they have all these androgen receptor modulator drugs like ostarine, and like RAD 1286 or whatever the hell it's called. So there's all kinds of things out there that have the potential to just act on the androgen receptor now, and they seem to cause dramatic improvements in hypertrophy and all the typical things that you'd see with testosterone. I think testosterone also increases or it has the potential to alter motor neurons from being type 1 to type 2 motor neurons. It'll increase the amount of myelin present on the axon, and it has the potential to like improve like nodes of Ranvier uh, concentrations so that the signal goes faster. And whatever the motor neuron is determines the kind of muscle fiber that you have downstream. So if I can change the motor neuron, I'll actually histologically change the fiber too.
Okay, so my head is like spinning with all these ideas now because you mentioned a whole bunch of things that I'd love to talk about more. And I'll kind of work backwards, and I'm just gonna spill my guts here, and then you can comment.
Yeah,
The first one was this idea of heat and overheating, and the thing I thought of first was that Stanford hand cooling device. I think they
yeah,
used it for cramping, and maybe the increase in heat was signaling some sort of inhibitory response. So and maybe that's why that device worked. The other was uh, Charlie had talked about, like, there was a couple of athletes where I was looking at their results and I said, wow, from what I gather, their training is very slow. They do longer reps, but these athletes were still running spectacular times at the 100 meters, but they weren't running those speeds or those distances. And he said, well, if they're taking performance enhancing drugs, anabolics, there's fiber conversion just by taking the drugs, right?
yeah,
So what you're saying makes perfect sense. All of these training means aren't changing anything, but
yeah.
what they're taking is changing it, right? So uh, again, elaborate on that. I just think it's fascinating that you bring these things up because it's all coming. What Charlie has said is being substantiated by what you're talking about now.
Yeah, I've always looked at like arguments that people have over training methodologies and just thought it's the biggest waste of time imaginable. It's like it's crazy. Like I've heard Mike Boyle talk about the idea of like picking the fly shit out of the pepper. And I think that's mostly what it is. And I have the benefit of having competed for a couple of world championships in strongman. And if you want to see a crazy sport from in terms of the approaches that people take in training, that's the best one because you have people that are completely uneducated doing things that make no sense and they win world championships. And it's a completely unregulated sport in terms of drugs. Like everybody's just taking all the drugs they want. And why wouldn't you if your goal is to like go to places that play like hardcore metal from the 80s and lift stones, it's more fun if you're stronger. And it's a crazy world, but I've always enjoyed kind of like countercultures and strange things and stuff like that, and just experimentation and finding out for real. But it's like it didn't matter what anybody did from their training as long as they knew how to do the event and they had the right internal chemistry, they would probably do really well. Um, so it was kind of like I can remember being beaten by a guy from Kentucky who was a coal miner, and I like he was literally drunk the morning of the competition from the previous night, and he went out and won the national championship that year. Um, but so I was like, there's no way that this guy's training is good. Like there's a 0% chance, but this guy just beat everybody by a large margin. And there's some very good athletes coming from a variety of different sports. And this guy had been a college defensive back in football. So he had, he was just a hell of an athlete, but I don't think he ever trained well a day in his life. Um, and I just saw this from guys coming from all over the world, and you talk to them and you're like, so what do you guys do in training? And the things they tell you are just insane. Like they made no sense. So it was just one of these things where it was like, if I'm being honest with myself, all of this time that I've probably spent trying to learn about the best and brightest methods of training, it might not make that much of a difference. And in the NFL too, like if you really get into like what are these guys doing in training, you just like shake your head. But does it really matter? I don't know. I don't know how much these things really matter. Like I'm at the point where I think what really matters is probably like, genetics is just huge. Did you sleep well? Do you believe in what you're doing? Are you confident? Like if you're confident and you had a good night's sleep and you have the genetics, you're probably going to do really well. Um, and especially with speed, strength, and power activities, it's just like the best athlete usually wins, and everybody knows who that guy is as soon as they show up. And it doesn't matter what that guy did. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
Well,
it's
it's great because we started off with like people in sports aren't very smart, and now we're into it doesn't really matter how you train, and it's all natural selection, which is fine. I mean, the older I get, the more I move to that conclusion as well. So
I think it's one of those sad but true things. But I think that here's where I think our saving grace comes in, is that I think that the athlete needs to train. They need to train. And I think they need to train hard. And I think that the best way to get somebody to train hard is if you believe in the product that you're selling them. And I do think that some things are better than others. I really do. I think that the degree to which training matters is probably minute. But we are the training people, and we need to get the people that we're trying to train to believe in what we're doing. And the more that you've gone ahead and understood things at a high quality level, like I feel like I can get people to break their backs for me. Like I really like when I get people in front of me and I'm working with them, they'll run through a brick wall for me because they can feel how much I care about this. And I care about it that much because I've spent so much time studying it and doing it. And that's what people respond to. So people that haven't studied as much as I have or haven't grinded as much as I have can't elicit that same response in the athletes that they're working with. And I think that's what matters. So I think it's a completely different reason that training knowledge matters. But I do think it matters from a coaching standpoint.
yeah, well, I've had this discussion with people like yourself before, where I think that good training is going to allow people to reach their potential, like if that's their potential. But there's a lot of bad training that can make you, fall well short of that and even hurt yourself. So
Yeah.
I believe you're right.
I want to take just a moment just to say like I'm the biggest specificity believer out there. I really think it all comes down to specificity. Like I think if I'm going to train 100-meter runners, I need to get them to run as many 100 meters during the course of the year that's as close to their top speed as they possibly can.
Which is great because you know what that is? That's competition.
Yeah.
And that's been borne out of different programs. If you have the right amount of competitions with the right level of competition, yes, definitely.
I think the trick is how do I get you to actually be able to run that many and not hurt yourself?
Very good.
I think that's all it is. And I think that's where the challenge comes in because then you have to actually analyze like what supports the ability to achieve the highest level of specific volume that the athlete can handle.
Yes.
Uh, and I think that's the whole ticket.
Okay, well, I have a few more questions, and I want to just talk about the application side because you talked about neurotransmitters and their roles. How do we take this information and pass it on to coaches so that they know how hard to push their athletes, how much, and then what other things can we do to manage these neurotransmitters, whether it's a nutrition side, sleep, other recovery methods? What are your thoughts on
Okay,
that?
great question. And this is kind of like, you can dance around with all the it depends answers, and the answers are yet to be seen and all that kind of stuff. And this is the best topic to do that in. And then you're never wrong, but you're also completely unhelpful. And that's the last thing I want to do. So I would say, like, let me go first to application and then work backwards from there. So I would say that what I want here is consistently really good dopamine levels. Like, now dopamine can make you a lunatic. Like, you can be crazy and psychotic basically if your dopamine levels reach too high. I don't know if that's the worst thing in the world for athletes, quite honestly. Like, unrealistic sort of belief in the supernatural, feeling as though they have powers that are excessive. And that's not the worst thing if I want a highly competitive person that thinks that they can dominate and do things that no one has ever done before. So I might want excessively high dopamine levels. I don't think I actually have a problem with that. So how do I get dopamine to get really high is kind of the question. And I would say that there's a few go-tos for that. Number one, vitamin D is absolutely critical for dopamine levels. It seems to have a precursor role with testosterone, with dopamine, with all that kind of stuff. So sunlight and being outdoors is probably an absolutely huge thing. And I mean, I don't think it's too much of most track and field people train their athletes places that are warm, right?
Yeah.
Like, you train outside, you find places like Southern California, places that have good sunlight. Like, you don't want to be where we live, basically. Um, so get outdoors and make sure you get those vitamin D levels up to a very high level. And I just recently saw something on vitamin D where if it gets to like really, really high levels that might even look like off the chart scary, you seem to get even more ergogenic performance enhancing effects. So I don't think you can go too wrong with just having your athletes out in the sun and experiencing fresh air. Um, and whatever increases vitamin D, do that. Um, and then secondly, sleep is just the mother of all dopamine increasing things. And what is the actual explanation for it? Because it also ties into, I think, doing things like sensory deprivation tanks might be huge for dopamine as well. So when you're asleep, one of the things the brain does is it cuts off the mind from the body, basically so that you don't physically act out your dreams. Um, I mean, it's really interesting. I've been doing a lot of stuff looking into sleep, and they've done studies with cats where they have not they've done something to the cats so that the muscles are still being recruited by the motor neurons during sleep, and they'll actually watch the cats physically act out their dreams, and it's like, oh my God, that's crazy stuff. But um, when you disconnect the body from the brain, you're disconnecting the motor, but you're disconnecting the afferent back to the brain, and you're decreasing sensory information. And the more that sensory information back to the brain is decreased, the higher the dopamine levels get. And it's also like the reason that we're dreaming is because of the loss of afferent information. So the brain is trying to make sense of something, even though there's no sense coming back to it. So you have all these like vivid hallucinatory experiences with odd everything. I mean, everything about dreams is odd. So, and that's what I mean about people potentially becoming psychotic with super high dopamine levels. Um, that's like schizophrenia and stuff. Let's go ahead with your question.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because I know, again, we'll go back to Charlie 30 years ago using low levels of electrical stimulation during sleep overnight.
Mm,
And he had tremendous success doing this with people with cerebral palsy,
Hmm.
and they had strength gains and they had function from this, which is non-specific, but maybe if they're dreaming about it, they have some sort of stimulation happening through different parts of their body. Who knows?
It's potentially, well, we know less about sleep than any other thing from a physiology standpoint. So, yeah, who the hell knows really with that? The other part about sleep is at certain points of sleep, what you'll have happen is it'll tie into the way that glial cells function in relation to neurons. So with most of the discussion regarding neurotransmitters, you're going to talk about concentrations of neurotransmitters in the synapse, as well as binding sensitivity with the neurotransmitter with the post neuronal receptor. Glial cells ultimately function as they remove neurotransmitters from the synapse, and they're capable of essentially like breaking them down, repackaging them, moving them to the presynaptic neuron, and also potentially like having like one neuron can send neurotransmitters to one other neuron. Glial cells have the potential to send neurotransmitters to a lot of neurons in a large region of the brain. And they potentially are the primary cell that's being helped out during sleep. So, from a neurotransmitter restoration standpoint and the ability to distribute neurotransmitter to large regions of the brain, the glial cell seems to be king in that regard. And sleep is really restoring the energy capabilities of the ability to distribute the neurotransmitter in a communication fashion from both the neuron and the glial cell within the brain. So, you know, like I said, certain things are probably more important than we give them credit for, and other things are probably less important than we give them credit for. Training styles are probably less important than what we think. But sleep is probably more important. The environment that you're living in, like being outdoors in places that have lots of sunlight, is probably huge. And then you get into some of this crazy stuff regarding excessive amounts of blue light from our modern lifestyles, like cell phone screens, TV screens, computer screens, all that stuff. Like we are getting inundated with too much blue light and not enough red light, and that's going to throw off mitochondrial function. Um, so, one thing that we haven't touched on here, but it seems to be huge, is chronic fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And we discussed that that's sort of like a disease kind of topic, but seems to also present itself in athletes. You get into the literature on chronic fatigue, and you see that approximately 80% of patients suffering from chronic fatigue seem to be post-viral. Viruses cause that on some level. And the viruses that they're talking about are ones that affect the mitochondrial DNA. And I think that we're probably going to see that as being a hugely important area is the health and status of mitochondrial DNA. And then you get into, well, what affects the physiology of mitochondria? And, we know mitochondria are the electron transport chain engine. They're ultimately these respiratory proteins that electrons have to tunnel through so that they can uh, be the receivers of hydrogen coming down through ATP synthase to rephosphorylate ATP. So these electrons and hydrogen ions that are moving through the mitochondria are dependent upon the health of the respiratory proteins existing in the intermitochondrial membrane space. I've got, I believe, 5 respiratory proteins in the mitochondria that electrons need to tunnel through so that they can get to oxygen and create the electrical gradient for hydrogen to come through to rephosphorylate ATP at ATP synthase. The ability of electrons to travel through the respiratory proteins, get to oxygen, depends on the coupling, the tightness, the distance between the proteins. And ultimately, the mitochondrial DNA along with nuclear DNA, the regular DNA in the nucleus, is responsible for building these respiratory proteins. And the construction of these proteins is going to determine the tightness, the coupling, the haplotype of the functioning of this whole system. It seems as though light is the primary signal for the functioning of mitochondrial DNA. And having the right light environment is one that's incredibly important for creating, like, you talk about protein synthesis. That is what is the end product of what a genome does. It probably does other stuff, but we'll just keep it simple. So mitochondrial DNA in a mitochondrial genome makes proteins ultimately through the same kind of mechanisms that nuclear DNA makes proteins. We need a ribosome and we need to build proteins. Usually we're busy talking about, actin and myosin and everything else, but I'm talking about respiratory proteins that need to be constructed in a very specific way so that I can have very good electron tunneling going through those respiratory proteins. When I have inefficient respiratory electron tunneling, I'll ultimately start to see electrons leak out of the respiratory protein tunneling system, escape into the mitochondrial environment and the environment of the cell outside the mitochondria. Ultimately, what happens, electrons, when they start interacting with other molecules, are going to cause oxidation. Oxidation is the root of all destruction of cellular functions. It is the root of all diseases. It is the root of allowing viruses to be able to affect us in a powerful way. So when I have a dysfunctional mitochondrial environment, I will have electrons leaking out into the cell, and I'll have electrons causing all kinds of havoc in the cellular environment, setting me up for disease and setting me up for expression of faulty proteins that don't function very well. So when I'm talking about vitamin D, I try to keep it simple for people. Vitamin D and testosterone and dopamine, cool. But the reality of it is that I want to be in a good light environment so that I don't allow electrons to tear me apart from the inside out and ultimately sap my career. And if you have excess blue light that's in a ratio that's way above and beyond other wavelengths of light acting on a mitochondria, you're going to have a serious problem on your hands. And, how does light actually get there? Well, light generally binds to the hemoglobin molecule in the bloodstream and is carried to the cell, and it sort of piggybacks into the mitochondria off of oxygen. So it's super fascinating stuff, but that's what I really care about more than most things. People need to exercise so that they're sending electrons through the mitochondrial respiratory tunneling system on a regular basis, and they need light interacting with this system on a regular basis. And if I'm doing that, I should be pretty good. And whether or not I do front squats or back squats probably makes no difference.
Have you done any research into some of these light therapy devices, like these things that people put in front of their faces? Like, is there anything to that?
I think that ultimately, if you look at stuff with lasers, you see that it's pretty amazing what that stuff can do with people. I don't know about light stuff that you're referring to. I can remember even in Super Training by Mel Siff, it talked about the old Soviets when they had created periodization. They ultimately created periodization because they saw their athletes' performance decreasing in the winter time. So they changed intensities and volumes so that they wouldn't be overtraining the athletes during that time period where they would typically see reductions in performance. And then all of a sudden they just started shining UV light on each other with UV lamps. And then they threw out their periodization model because they didn't see the same reductions in performance and ability to handle volume as soon as they just got UV on the athletes. So I would imagine that it would probably be pretty similar stuff to that.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Just to kind of conclude here, and we could go on for hours, of course.
Probably.
where do you see, like, I'm going to focus on you. Where do you see your focus going in terms of moving things forward for yourself, in terms of understanding how this can be tied to the more applied side, and how you can convey this information to coaches so that they can benefit from it?
Well, I feel like I'm in my own infancy of studying this stuff. It's kind of it's like I've looked at so many different areas within training, and it leads you to some common denominators, I think. I think that the common denominators that things take you to are like mitochondrial physiology is a common denominator. I think that a lot of people that have been searching for a long time end at. I think that the DNA genetic physiology is something that takes you to. I think that neuronal physiology, so the brain, the mitochondria, and the DNA, I think are just like these big rocks, and they're big rocks that I've been led to recently within the past couple of years, I would say, and it's like, man, those are really complicated areas. So I'm just excited about personally thinking that I've found the areas that really matter. And I'm not going to pretend like I understand these on a level where I could be super helpful to anybody. Um, I might just confuse people and kind of ruin their day, and then they just go back to what they were doing anyways, and they'll probably be fine. But in some ways, I think that these are the topics that will ultimately drive performance with most athletes going forward. And it's like, if you're doing a good job, you're probably almost mistakenly affecting those systems. Or athletes are regulating themselves in many ways by kind of, I've given this analogy before at many talks, but I've told people about like dogs when they get trapped in rooms. And have you ever locked a dog in a room that it doesn't want to be in? It typically has go-to responses. It will bark and it will scratch, and oftentimes the door will open in response to these strategies, and the dog concludes that the mechanism for opening doors is barking and scratching, and sometimes the dog will bark and scratch, and the door doesn't open, but the dog will bark louder and scratch harder, and sometimes that causes the door to open. So sometimes you just need to try harder. Or maybe the door hasn't opened for a little while, so the dog keeps barking and scratching for half an hour, 2 hours. And then the door opens, so the dog concludes, well, sometimes you just have to try harder for longer. And I just think that in many ways, we as coaches have been these dogs that have been trapped in rooms, and we've discovered that we can open doors through like barking and scratching. Or like, ultimately, I'm just saying that like we are stuck with the methodologies that we believe work, and sometimes those methodologies aren't developing the athlete, as the athlete's stuck. So let's just try harder, or let's do this longer. Like, let's increase intensity and let's increase volume. And it's like, barking and scratching has nothing to do with opening doors. And I'm okay with admitting that maybe the things that I've been doing have nothing to do with improving performance, but I've mistakenly elicited some mechanism that, unbeknownst to me, has actually caused these changes. And I think that most people should be willing to admit that maybe they have no idea what they're doing. And I think that once you do that, it takes a lot of burden off of you and allows you to have more of an open mind. Um, because like, I've just seen so many damn things work that seem to be unrelated, but there's got to be something more to it that actually is the common denominator that matters. Um, so I don't know. Like, I just think that I think I'm skeptical, but I will always go with something that I think looks right to me. Like, I am a believer in that. Like, I think that if something looks right, feels right, smells right, kind of keep doing it, and don't stop until it stops working. I think we had a quick discussion in Indiana, and I was asking you, like, why don't sprint coaches make the athletes sprint every single day? Because I could see that potentially working. Just, how about we just run as fast as we can 7 days a week, but maybe only sprint that fast for 1 or 2 reps and you're done. And just like, has anybody ever actually tried that? And I think you said that people have kind of tinkered with that,
Yeah.
and that people have kind of gotten faster, but most of the time the athletes are unwilling to kind of go along with that.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like I've been pushing towards that and getting away from traditional periodization and kind of throwing it in the garbage and saying, yeah, let's just control the volumes, but the intensity can be high every day. And
Yeah.
I've had better results. And again, like you said, the door is opening, but I'm still not sure if it's the scratching or the barking, right? But um, I've seen better results, like even psychologically from doing that. Body composition,
Mm.
with no changes in diet. If anything, these guys say they're hungrier and they want to eat more, but they're losing weight. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I think I'm just going to keep pushing in that direction, like we talked about, and why not be more specific more frequently, but just manage the volumes.
That's, when it came to strongman events, like part of what I liked about that sport was that, I would generally try to compete in 6 to 10 competitions a year, one every 2 months, generally speaking. So you get a new contest, and the events are always different every time. And you basically have about 7 to 8 weeks to get ready for the new contest. And it was kind of like, oh, we have this weird new event. I've never done this before. Well, I better try it. And, if you train it for like 7 to 8 weeks and you literally, it's the easiest sport to program for because you see the competition and, okay, well, I'll just do that in practice every time. Like, I'm not going to squat and bench press because I don't have to do that. I have to pick up this stone and carry it 20 feet and put it on top of this box. So that's all I'm going to do. And, you just consistently get better. But I wouldn't do anything else because I would literally look at it like, I don't want to have to recover from anything that's not the thing that I have to do. Like that is purely taking away recovery energy. And I think it's tough with a sport like track and field where all you're doing is running. With strongman there was variation constantly. So it makes it a little bit more exciting. Like, I've been doing the same event for 8 weeks and like, oh, quick, cool. Now I have the chance to train this other completely different thing. But I think that in some ways the coaches can be the problem.
Yep.
Because if you're a coach and you've been watching someone do the same thing day after day after day, you just get bored of watching it. And
Or
it's like
you get insecure and you're like, I got to do something different, I think, right?
yeah, yep. And sometimes I just think like, don't change a thing. Like, why are you changing anything? Like, but it's tough. I coach people all day, and I sometimes just don't want to see the person do the same workout that I've watched 6 times in a row. So it's like I have to change something, and I probably made it worse. But it's just, it's there's so many interesting little pieces that I think that we could, like you said, we could probably talk about this all day.
So I want to get people to get in contact with you. Are you speaking anywhere anytime soon? Is there anything coming up where people can come talk to you?
I'm going to be speaking at the Beginner's Mind Retreat, which will be in Costa Rica in the first week of April. I know that that's already sold out. And then after that, I know that I'm going to be going over to China in October to do some stuff for about a week. But I don't have anything else lined up right now. But I always like doing any kind of presentation. And, it's always, people always ask me, like, what do I want to present on? I'm like, well, what do you want me to present on? Like, just give me a new challenge. Like, point me in a direction and let me attack it. And I'll study it and I'll tell you what I've found on it. And I don't know, people don't seem to like that answer. It's kind of, you know what it is? It's the same thing that I get when I go to the barber shop and the guy says, well, what do you want? And I say, I don't know, whatever you think will look good. And then they don't know what to do with that request. But yeah, what I liked is, you kind of said to me, like, I'm real curious in neurotransmitters and fatigue. And I thought to myself, Well, that sounds great. Now I'm real curious about it, and yeah, let's take a look at what that is. So I love it when people do that for me, but
Okay.
most of the time people want me to talk about dopamine or something like that. But
Well, I think this is like once people get a chance to listen to this interview, and it's, I hope it opens some doors and it gets people to get you to their event and talk about it because I mean, it can get very deep and detailed, but it really does come back to how does this affect me in training, and
yeah,
I think that's going to be the important part of it, and getting people to think about all these complex things, but what is the simple application?
yeah, and I would just say like get your athletes to believe in it, get them to train hard, get them to sleep, and the sleep is tricky because I think that it's whatever physiologically allows the athlete to sleep better is good. It's kind of like all roads point to sleep, and and maybe one of the things that we haven't looked at enough is the management of the athlete's airway, because sleep apnea is a major problem. And, even being able to figure out which of your athletes probably have airway based problems that is limiting their ability to sleep well, that will matter more than almost anything. But also, like athletes that aren't outdoors, that aren't getting exposure to the environment, they're not going to sleep as well. Food can affect sleep. Caffeine can affect sleep. That which negatively affects sleep will negatively impact the athlete. Bad training will affect sleep. If the athlete is sleeping better, everything that you're doing is probably smart and right. If the athlete is sleeping worse with whatever you're doing, it's probably bad. And it speaks to personal relationships, anxiety, worry, all that kind of stuff. But take a look at the airway, take a look at the sleep, and you probably have solved more problems than worrying about linear periodization or any other training based
Yeah.
question.
Well, I got a great book title for you. It's going to be in big bold letters. Training doesn't matter, and then on the bottom, but here are some things that do. So there you go. I'm going to set.
That'll make me a lot of friends.
Well, I want to thank you, Pat, for joining us, and I think this is going to create a lot of good discussion. So thanks for taking the time, and I look forward to speaking again and hopefully meeting you. I know there's an event possibly this summer that the IFAST guys were talking about. So hopefully
Okay.
I can run into you too. So
Yeah, that would be great.
awesome.
Well,
Thank.
Derek, thank you.
Okay.
So some fabulous information provided by Pat Davidson there. And if you're like me, you were writing notes during, after, asking more questions about, what do I need to know about central nervous system fatigue and how it relates to training, and how can I change things to make it better for my athletes. So, if you have questions, we want to engage you in discussion. We'll get the questions to Pat. You can contact him directly. You can get us on Facebook at Strength Power Speed with no vowels. Also on Twitter at Strength Power Speed. We'll be posting on YouTube. And again, this is one of those subjects where I think, we can get into deeper discussion, find out what people have been doing, what the impacts have been of the type of work, how much recovery is needed. So, please join us, and we'll probably be engaging Pat very soon again, because there's a lot of subjects that can branch off of this. So thank you once again for joining strengthpowerspeed.com.